So this is the ninth. So this is the ninth little sort of bite-sized presentation and workshop, and it's in the series around how do we sort of use evidence, really? How do we gather and use evidence actually in practice? How do we develop things, really? So it's got that developmental focus. And I'm really pleased to introduce Emma Miller, who I've worked with. I've had the privilege to know and work with for many years, and she's the sort of, if anybody of you from Scotland and you talk about personal outcomes approach, you know, Emma's always the first person they mention. So it's really nice Emma's coming to talk with us. I'm also pleased because Emma, although she's worked across the board with social workers and all sorts of people, she's also very interested and has done a lot of work with care homes, and she's really interested in, she just published a paper, haven't you, recently, Emma, about the reality and the rhetoric of taking a person-centered approach in care homes. So I'm going to hand it straight over to Emma, and she's going to talk about how we take this outcomes-focused approach in care homes, particularly with people with communication difficulties.
Thanks, Nick. And hang on 2 seconds. I might go back to the beginning of the presentation, and then I do view slideshow, and hopefully that's, yeah. Does that, everyone see that okay? Brilliant. Okay, so thanks very much for the introduction, Nick, and thanks also for the invitation to speak with your colleagues today. As Nick says, I've had a long-standing interest in care homes, and it has been a few years since I last worked directly with care homes. So I'm really relishing the opportunity of having this conversation today to reconnect with that sector. And I suppose before I start, I was just thinking about when I was making a cup of coffee before coming into the meeting, and just thinking about, again, the context that we're in and the fact that, you know, we're sort of coming up for 2 years, which is hard to believe, into this global pandemic. And I guess I just wanted to really start by acknowledging the role that people have played in frontline services in care homes and elsewhere, health and social care, in, you know, managing to continue to work through the most extraordinarily challenging circumstances almost that we could be imagining. And just really to say hats off to everyone who's made that contribution during this period and is continuing to do so, because I think it's a hugely challenging time. But also, I guess, to take a moment to celebrate some of the amazing achievements in that context as well. So winding back to the presentation, and just what I'm going to cover quite briefly is just thinking about personal outcomes in the context of care homes, and thinking about, in the Welsh context, the what matters conversation and all the focus around that in policy, and also in a slightly wider sense on personalisation. So how do we engage with what matters to each individual in the context of the care home, and perhaps a need for a bit more honesty and a bit more nuance around that, because we are talking about a very specific context. So just very briefly, I have a few slides where I'm going to talk about personal outcomes in general, then a little bit about translating that into the context of the care home. And then, as Nick said, we did some research a few years ago with care homes in a local authority in Scotland and published a paper on that. And I'm just going to tell you a few of the punchlines from that paper, just to give you a sense of what our thoughts were based on the evidence of speaking to care home staff. And then I'm going to show a short video, which is about how do we identify outcomes with people who are not able to verbalise their own outcomes, and that very skilled work to do that, which is already going on in your setting. So just thinking about what do we mean by personal outcomes, I guess, and going back to an organisational guide that Ailsa Cook and I wrote nearly 10 years ago based on our learning at that point, and just thinking about personal outcomes fundamentally being about what matter to people in the context of their lives in general. And I suppose sometimes when we hear the word outcome, we think of it as being the result of something or the end point of something. But when we're talking about personal outcomes, we're also talking about really understanding where we start from with a person. So I guess in the context of a care home, what makes this resident tick? What makes them feel comfortable? What makes them feel safe? And how do we work together to achieve that? So involving that person from the start is really important. And that's where we talk about the what matters conversations. And I guess one of the things that I'm going to cover quite a bit in this presentation is thinking about conversation in the broadest sense of the word. So not just what people verbalise, but what they communicate non-verbally and what we pick up about them from relatives and so on as well. I guess a core part of the outcomes work in both Scotland and Wales, and it has been amazing. I mean, Nick's sort of mentioned already, but we have had this long-term conversation between Wales and Scotland and that opportunity to exchange learning. And actually with Jill Toms now around carers as well. But at the heart of this is there something really important about acknowledging the strengths that people have as well as what they can do, whereas maybe services in the past have tended to really focus on the deficits and the problems and how we match services to problems. Just maybe another little nuance around outcomes is that it's as much about focusing on why something matters as what matters. So it's not just about, say, for example, we've had lots of arguments over the years about whether a holiday is an outcome. It's not really an outcome because why somebody wants to go on holiday can hugely vary from one person to the next. So it can be about wanting to have some downtime, some R&R, or it might be about wanting to try a different culture and see some museums, for example, might be why. And so knowing the why helps us to make sure that we're working as best as we can around what matters to that person. And I guess there's something in all of this as well about, you know, if we are able to track outcomes in our systems and understand how many of the people we support feel safe, for example, that can be gold dust information in terms of organising our services the best that they can be. So just moving on to the exchange model of assessment, I think this has been really helpful with it's absolutely core to an outcomes approach to what matters. I think in the past, we've had a lot of concerns from practitioners about raising expectations. So if we say to people, we're going to work to what matters to you, but we can't actually fix whatever matters to the person. So can we keep that conversation closed down to the things that we've got control over? And actually how unhelpful that can be from everyone's perspective, and maybe understanding that it's not about fixing everything. And so a core part of a personal outcomes approach is something that's really challenging for all of us. It's about moving from being a fixer to a facilitator. It's not about fixing everything. It's about working with the person to work out what's possible within the circumstances that we're in, and maybe a little bit of creativity now and again to do something differently. So the exchange model that you see here, this was adapted for the care home context. So you do have the resident's view being absolutely essential in the exchange model. Also relatives' views, where there are relatives involved to bring their views into the mix. You might have more than one assessor, and I know that's true often in the care home context, that there can be multiple perspectives contributing to the plan for that person. There's also the organisation's view, so there are issues around duty of care, for example, and you know what resources are available at that particular stage. So really what we're talking about is phenomenally skilled work, and I often feel that the skill in this is quite hidden, because that negotiation with all of those perspectives to agree the outcomes and work towards the outcomes is pretty much gold dust work. So I guess another feature of our learning around outcome-focused conversations over time, the what matters conversations, is that it is a shift to a conversation. So maybe assessment in the past, and I'm thinking more community-based here, single shared assessment in Scotland or unified assessment in Wales being, you know, a weighty tome of question, you know, sometimes literally more than 100 questions, and having to just have a back and forward, how far can the person walk, how do they manage with eating, etc. And actually, where is the room in that for working out what is important to the person? So the idea of conversation is so fundamental to what we're trying to do here, that maybe to start with, who are you, how are you, and how can we work together? And then the information that is necessary, perhaps kind of coming after that rather than driving the interaction. Yeah, and so we have a cartoonist called Graham Ogilvie in Scotland who pitches up at all the events in health and social care and produces wonderful cartoons based on what he hears people saying. And at quite an early stage, he came along and produced this diagram, which was about let's talk, not tick. So to try to get away from the tick box assessment to the actual conversation. So yeah, just an illustration of that. And yeah, I suppose thinking back, so what do we mean by conversation in the context of the care home, perhaps with many people who would have more challenges with being able to verbalise what's important to them. And so Karen Barry has worked with us a lot in Scotland in different contexts to progress this work. And she produced this kind of graphic equaliser, which is a little bit out. Nick really likes the graphic equaliser because it makes sense to people of our generation, but a lot of young people have no idea what a graphic equaliser is. So it's got its limitations, but I guess the idea is to fine tune around that person, what all the possible sources of information are. So their verbal communication, their non-verbal communication, the life story, the records, where it's relevant, the perspective of families coming into the mix to try to build that picture of what makes that person tick. But interestingly, so this diagram, Karen and I did, when we did the work in care homes in Scotland, which was actually about 5 years ago, we took a few diagrams in to show the staff and like to get their perspective on the diagram. So we showed them the exchange model, which they really liked. And then we showed them this diagram of the graphic equaliser about how we use different sources of information to work out the plan for that person. And the care home staff, they brought in some concepts which are in the background of the diagram, which were about honesty, trust and integrity. And what they spoke to us about quite a lot when you're trying to develop the plan and take on board the different perspectives is that sometimes honesty can be quite difficult in a care home because there are so many different pressures, including pressures to perform, and that that could make it quite challenging at times, that maybe sometimes overselling what was possible in terms of one-to-one staffing and things like that. And that there needed to be a little bit more honesty, particularly with relatives sometimes, about what was possible and what wasn't possible. But we'll come back to some of that when I go through the quotes from staff in the next few slides. So we wrote an article and it was only published a couple of years. I mean, sometimes it can take years to get, a few years to get round to actually publishing. It's quite a tortuous process, but the article at the end of the day that we did publish in Ageing in Society, based on what care home staff told us, it was called Ethical Dilemmas, and it was focused on balancing choice and risk with the duty of care in thinking about personalisation in the care home. So I don't think there's quite the same pressure in Wales as there is in Scotland to push personalisation in terms of having a budget into care home contexts. And that's what we were really trying to explore, is what are the limits and possibilities around this. And actually, I can't fully see my slides. I can see the faces down the right-hand side of the screen. So I'm going to have to try and guess what.
Do you want me to read them?
Would you mind, Nick? And then I can add, because I can't actually see there.
Which seat can't you, on the right?
So so why don't I try to read what I can, and when I'm stuck, I'll say Nick and you.
Okay.
It's a bit of a team effort here. But yeah, I suppose it just reiterating about the limits to choice and control and individualism in the care home, because we're talking about a group living context. And so I think some of the issues about personalisation are also relevant in society in general. But when you move into a care home, they're intensified. So some of this stuff is relevant to take back out of the care home as well. But really, we were finding through talking to care home staff that what we needed was a more relationship-based and inclusive approach to personalisation and group living. And what we did was, based on what the care home staff talked about, so we worked with them over 4 sessions. I think it was about over 7 weeks. And we went back in, and it wasn't always, things didn't work out as planned. We thought we were going to work with the same group of care home staff over 4 sessions, and actually slightly different people pitched up each time. We had a few people who were there for all 4 sessions, but the others changed because of the pressures on staffing. So there were some limitations that we didn't have a continuous conversation, but there were also some benefits because we would come back with some ideas from session 1 and we would test them out with some new care home staff. So it actually worked out fine. But one of the key issues that staff spoke about, thinking about personalisation, was about food and eating, and how fundamental food and eating are to staying alive, staying well, but also in terms of choice and control, quite a consumer thing, can be quite a consumer thing as well. And one of the staff said about, some of the challenges around all of this, about perhaps thinking about the strengths-based aspect of what matters and supporting the residents' capabilities to do things for themselves when they were trying to support multiple people. And as one of them said, I just have 1 pair of hands. Like, there is a limit to what I can feasibly do. So that was a key early issue that was raised with us. And Nick, I am going to have to hand over to you because I actually can't see enough of this to guess what's in it. But if you read, because this is just 3 care home staff, this is 3 of them making comments on this. So it's just a conversation, so it's fine just to read it out, Nick.
Okay, I can't do the Scottish accent, I'm afraid. You've got to be quiet in the dining room, but some people don't like quiet in the dining room. Some people like a lot of hustle and bustle. Second quote, sometimes people like to sit at a wee table with the television so they can watch the news and things, whereas part of the policy from the care inspectorate is that they should have quiet time, so the TV and radio should be off. And quote 3, yes, but I think the idea of that's because it's for people who are very, very vulnerable, and if distracted, they won't eat at all, and it has a knock-on effect on their health. It's complex, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It is complex, and how I don't know, some of the expectations are so simplistic, aren't they? About everyone should have this or everyone should have that, but actually there's a constant negotiation going on there. So yeah, and sorry, Nick, again, I'll have to ask you to read this quote as well.
Yeah. You can, if you click on the little box, you can drag the box down to to low. If you click on the little things, you can move them around.
I can hold it down here and I can see the whole thing. Thanks, Nick. So again, this issue about balancing choice, reasonable risk, and the duty of care. And this carer saying it's finding the balance. You can be very person-centred, but if they don't want to get up and don't want to eat, do you let them starve to death? You can't do that. So taking the difference between your duty of care and being person-centred to them is a very, very fine line. So really what I'm trying to do with these quotes that I've pulled out is to just illustrate some of the complexities that care home staff very honestly spoke about trying to navigate. Oops, and now I'm trying to move on to there we go. No, there's one missing, yeah. But I think, so what that gets into is some of the challenges, but I would have to say, and this is a direct quote from our article, and it's our take on things, that despite all of these challenges, the senior carers participating in the work remain hugely enthusiastic about the work that they do. They grasp opportunities to build and strengthen relationships with the unique older people they care for, and to discover and support the things that matter to them. And so, I mean, we were hugely impressed by the phenomenal volumes of knowledge that those care staff held in their heads about the people that they support. Phenomenal. And yet, it was really interesting sometimes when they spoke about things that they knew made some of those residents tick, and they said, "Oh, but that wouldn't be in the records." They just hold it in their heads because the weight of recording is all about volumes of fluid and so on. And I guess what we were trying to say in the article was that the growing emphasis on independence, consumer choice, and control in policy needs to be reconciled with the reality of the increasingly complex needs of advanced old age. And it's not at all, I mean, I think it can be a very contentious thing to talk about, because if you question the focus on choice and control, it's almost like you're saying that, you know, people shouldn't have choice and control. It's not that at all. It's about balancing choice and control with complexity, and especially in group living. So that's a very quick just overview of some of the work we've been doing around personal outcomes and thinking about that in the context of the care home. And now I want to share with you a short video. I think it's about 4 minutes, at the very most 5 minutes. And again, it's Karen Barry, who helped with that work in the care home and writing the article, who's made this short video just very recently. And it is about how do we identify what matters with people who aren't able to verbalise what's important to them. And so we'll just go into that video and then we can come back and have some discussion, or possibly I think breakout rooms first. But anyway, right, so I have to click on here first and then, I'll come back to that slide after actually. So this should be the video now, and hopefully it will just run. There we go.
Have you optimized for sound, Emma?
Oh.
Having good conversations is a cornerstone of a personal outcomes approach. The notions talk and conversation are powerful and enduring motifs. Alongside this is a concern to make sure that the emphasis on conversation, as conventionally understood, does not inadvertently exclude people who face difficulties communicating through words. Such individuals are part of a diverse yet significant group, which includes those who have experienced communication difficulties throughout their lives, those who have acquired difficulties suddenly, and others with difficulties that progress over time. It follows that individuals can experience very different problems in the production and/or comprehension of verbal language. Communication is essentially about making connections, being understood and understanding others. And a huge range of augmentative and alternative communication methods have been developed to help deepen understandings, from high-tech to low-tech, visual and tactile, symbolic and gestural. This circle model depicts a continuum of comprehension, from internal sensory understandings through concrete to more abstract temporal understandings. It's not intended to be a static model, but it can be useful when thinking how best to enter the person's world, respect and work with their capabilities, to ask, where on the continuum is the person I am working with right now? This is especially important in outcomes-focused practice, where the concept of outcome and many types of outcome are quite abstract in nature. For some people, personal outcomes may need to be understood and then worked towards in other ways, whether by offering concrete examples, trying things out, or through observation and interaction in non-verbal ways, augmented by family members and carers' accounts, life stories and support records. We always draw on different sources when forming a view of a person and what matters to them. When our reliance on verbal communication decreases, the use of these other sources is likely to increase. Non-verbal communication, sometimes termed post-verbal, as in going beyond words, includes gestures, body language, unspoken emotions and actions, plus other ways of communicating through the body, from the subtle act of shivering to self-calming or even self-harming behaviours. All communication, of course, is two-way, and this reminds us to think not only about our own body language, but also our behaviours, actions and inactions, and what they might or might not convey. In practice, supporting what matters to someone with communication difficulties may entail acting on insights from life stories, such as discovering one resident used to work as a postmistress and creating the opportunity for her to help sort and deliver the mail, or acting on the knowledge that another resident used to be a professional dancer and adapting ways of walking alongside him to the familiar dancer's hold. Equally, however, life story may provide insights into behaviours that challenge others and that would otherwise have been managed through medication or even hospitalisation. Simpler everyday practices also help to understand and support the things that matter. Exploring what a perfect day would look like using image cards, speaking to family members to learn about and sustain favoured routines, perhaps enacted as a couple, and ensuring personal care preferences documented in a support plan are acted upon all play their part. The body too is a great communicator. Whilst examples can perhaps at first seem mundane, the effects can be profound. For instance, a carer noticing that one lady's feet were like blocks of ice. The lady in question was very reluctant to stay in bed at night, had not been sleeping, and was becoming increasingly distressed and disrupting the sleep of others. The issue was resolved through the simple introduction of bed socks, something her son later remembered she had always worn at home. Of course, not all issues are so easily resolved. Many specialist support services have developed expertise in a form of support that sees behaviour that challenges as part of the person, a form of communication, not something to get rid of. This expertise includes finding imaginative ways to work through upsetting trigger events that cannot be avoided, such as creating a photo story to help explain to a young woman with learning difficulties that a favourite carer has gone on maternity leave. Thinking about what matters to people who have difficulties communicating through words highlights that making connections and reaching shared understandings can be important outcomes in their own right. Ultimately, it reminds us of the most essential aspects of outcomes-focused practice. These depend on good communication, whatever form that communication may take.
Okay, so Karen, she actually recently completed her, well, it was about a couple of years ago now, but she completed her PhD, which was about working with older people with dementia in Edinburgh. I think she worked with about 14 people, but some of whom were spouses or partners of people with dementia, but she worked really closely with them for quite a long time. So that's kind of fed into that video. So I'm not going to go back to the previous slide because I've just realised we're already half an hour into the meeting, and I think it would be nice to have the breakout rooms. I think it's quite important to have those opportunities to chat to each other. So any thoughts, Jill or Nick, on the next?
Yeah, do you want to stop sharing the screen?
Oh yes, of course. Hang on. There we go.
Because there's 14, so should we go into 2 breakout rooms? Would that be possible? And we can explore those 2 things. It'd be really nice to know your experiences of this. What's possible and what do people want? What's your experience of balancing, you know, the choice of an individual resident and the needs of other residents and the workings of the home? I think that'd be really interesting if you could talk about that in your context. So that's the first question around balancing what's wanted and what's possible for whom. And that's really, and it is really complex, isn't it? I'm sure you're constantly juggling things, so that if you could talk about that. And then I suppose the second one is your own experiences of taking that sort of personalized approach with people with dementia. How do you get, have you got some experiences of how you've got to the bottom of what makes someone tick and what matters to them, and just sharing your thoughts about how you did that or what enabled that, really. So it's those 2 things about dealing with trying to live in a community and actually look at individuals' needs within a community. It's just like a family, though, isn't it? When you decide what you... And then the second one around your own experiences or anything you'd be pleased to share around how you've been able to work with people with dementia to find out what matters and put that into practice. So, okay, so should we have 10 minutes? Is that right, 10 minutes for the 2 rooms? So if we come back at about, or say, should we say come back at 1:45? Because it's